A veteran bought a haunted cabin for $200. Then his dog found what locals feared for years. Snow had been falling since noon, the kind that swallowed sound and made the woods look older than they were. By dusk, Mason Hale eased the county key into the swollen lock of Lot 12B and shouldered the door inward. The cabin gave back a tired groan. Pine walls, stone hearth, air that smelled of mildew, cold ash, and the long absence of people. He stood still and let the silence find its level. Arlo trotted in a slow circle, nose low, tail carried like a measuring rod. He was a German shepherd with the heavy chest and sober eyes of a working dog who had done his years. The unit patch was gone from his collar. The habits were not. He drifted past the table, touched the door frame with his shoulder as if counting exits, then halted in the middle of the room without looking at Mason. His ears pricked. His stare settled on the hearth. Mason set the duffel by the door and waited. He had learned a long time ago that the first thing you do in a new room is listen to the dog. Arlo stepped forward. One more step. Then his body tightened like a cable. No bark. A low growl reached up from somewhere under the floor. It made the loose glass in the window buzz. Easy, Mason said, though his own pulse had picked up. He crossed the room. The hearthstones were old field rock fitted without vanity, stained black above the opening. The firebox itself was cold. When he leaned in, the scent shifted. Not ash. Something flat and sealed, like a storage locker that had not been opened in years. Arlo did not move. His gaze locked on a point just under the mantelshelf, a handspan left of center. His tail went still. In Fallujah, this posture had meant stop now. In Idaho, it apparently meant the same thing. Mason crouched, gloved fingers traveling across the lowest row. The first two stones were rough and grainy with time. The third was smoother. The mortar line around it had a sheen that did not belong to the rest of the wall. He pressed his thumb to it. It did not crumble. It dented, faintly, as if something modern had been smeared there and left to mimic age. He stood and reached the corner where a crowbar leaned, still wearing a bright orange price sticker from the hardware store in town. When he came back, Arlo shifted 1 inch, made room, and went still again. Mason set the flat of the bar into the seam and put his weight on it, careful and gradual. The mortar gave with a sound like a cork turning. He changed angles, pressed again. This time the stone moved, millimeters at first, then a grind and a faint release of cooler air. He set the bar aside and lifted with both hands. The weight surprised him. Old rock, old secrets. The slab came away and thudded to the floor. Behind it, a dry cavity opened, just wide enough for a forearm. Arlo leaned forward, nose at the edge, breathing in short pulls that sounded like counting. Mason clicked on his small flashlight and threw the beam into the dark. A green metal case sat at the bottom, battle-scuffed, stencil half-worn. Next to it, 3 leather notebooks tied with brittle twine. Every surface inside the hole was dust-dry, as if water had never found the place. Mason reached in and lifted the notebooks first. The twine fell apart under his fingers. He set them on the floorboards and pulled the metal case out with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. He did not flip the latch. Not yet. He opened the top notebook. The first pages were simple. Dates, weather, tracks of mule deer by the creek. Then the handwriting changed tone, still neat but pressed harder into the paper. They said the water was fine. Found 2 foxes dead at the bend. Foam at the mouth. No odor, metallic taste on air near 4A. He turned the page. A name sat on the header block printed with the steadiness of a man determined not to shake. E. Renshaw. The room got colder. 20 years back, the valley had lost a freelancer named Eli Renshaw. He had come asking about water rights, survey lines, a set of wells that were not on any public map. His pickup had been found half buried in snow on a fire road. No blood, no body. The story had lived in the diner long after the sheriff stopped answering questions. Arlo issued a single breathy sound, not a whine, not a growl. Mason looked up from the page. The dog had shifted off the hearth and angled toward the front window. His head was low now. His ears were not pointed at the notebooks. They were trained on the glass. Mason set the journal down and crossed the room in 3 quiet steps. He eased a fingertip into the curtain and lifted the edge. Snow veils came down steady through the pines. The trail from the road curled like a small white spine toward the porch. There, at the bend where the trees hid the last stretch, a darker shape hung in the storm. No sound. Not a truck. Heat on cold air. The faint smear of exhaust drifting sideways. It slid out of view as if someone had let the clutch up slow. Mason let the curtain fall and returned to the journal. He felt the old tremor in his shoulder where the shrapnel lived. He read the next line. 3rd unmarked truck this week. Parked near Creekbed 4A. Lights off. Left at 2:13 a.m. The paragraph beneath it had been written fast. Sheriff came by. Said to ease up on paranoia. Saw him later with the men at the ridge. This place keeps its own rules. I am not invited. A cold draft moved through the doorway to the bedroom and curled around his ankles. The cabin creaked, soft and tired. The heaviness in the air did not feel like ghosts. It felt like a house that had been asked to hold its breath too long. He unlatched the green case. The hinges stuck, then opened with a tacky click. Inside, foam-cradled vials of water and soil, each capped and labeled in block script. Dates, coordinates. The lids had been sealed with paraffin. In a side pouch, folded printouts lay banded with a rubber strip that had turned to sap. He teased. 1 free. Lab analysis fields looked professional. The headings clipped. Contaminants detected. Benzene. Arsenic. Toluene. Levels exceed federal thresholds by factor 10 and above. He set the paper aside and realized the tips of his fingers were shaking. Arlo padded back to the hearth and sat with his shoulder touching Mason's knee. He rested there without leaning, a post driven in hard ground. Mason put a hand on the dog's back and felt the low, steady hum of a body alert but unafraid. He had felt that hum in alleys on the far side of the world. It had kept him alive. He opened the second notebook. The first page had a map sketched by hand. A ridgeline, a creek cut, circles marked in red grease pencil. At the bottom corner, 1 word in block letters, Northbridge. He said it aloud under his breath, the way you try a name to see if it fits. Northbridge Minerals had a lay-down yard 2 counties over and a reputation for leaving job sites faster than they arrived. He folded the map shut. A soft sound came from the firebox. Not wood. Not a rodent nest. Metal robin against stone. He raised the light and played it along the bricks. Something small glinted behind the grate toward the back left corner. He reached into the cold hearth and slid it out with 2 fingers. A button battery. New. No soot. No wear. He did not look at Arlo. He did not need to. The dog's ears told him everything. What you hide is not what you fear. It is what you plan to come back for. Mason went still and listened. The cabin returned to its earlier quiet, but the quiet had a new edge. He looked at the opened hole again and at the stone he had set aside. The inner face of the slab, the side that had faced the cavity, wore a smear of adhesive. It had tiny threads caught in it, the white fuzz of a fresh shop towel. He ran his thumb along the mortar line inside the opening where he had pried. His thumb came away tacky. The seal was not decades old. It was months. maybe weeks. Someone had unsealed this void and sealed it again after the last snow. Someone who either worked fast or felt confident he would not be interrupted. The room shifted on its axis. The story in the notebooks was not an artifact. It was an active wound. Snow thickened outside. The first true dark of mountain evening pressed against the windows. Mason closed the green case, wrapped the notebooks in an old wool shirt from his duffel, and slid the bundle back into the cavity. He did not replace the stone yet. He stood and went to the door, lifted the bolt, and eased it into place. Then he crossed to the back, checked the second exit, and set a chair under that knob. Not because he believed chairs stop men, because they slow them. Arlo had moved to the window again. He stood there for a long time with his head just below the sill, watching the bend in the trail, the angle his training taught him to hold, the one that let a dog see without being seen. He made no sound. Mason lit the oil lamp on the table and turned the flame low. He set the sat phone where the signal sometimes reached between storms and left it closed for now. He pulled his rucksack closer with the toe of his boot and drew out a small field scanner and a roll of contractor bags. He did not have to tell Arlo what came next. The dog lay down with his body between the table and the hearth, facing the door. He worked in that quiet for an hour, photographing labels, logging dates, scanning a handful of pages from the first notebook. The lamp hissed. The cabin settled, a little less hollow each time the wind pushed and let go. He stopped when he heard a vehicle again. Not near, not on the road. Distant. A muffled climb, a stall, a reverse. Someone testing the limits of a hill in two-wheel drive, because they knew 4 would make tracks anyone could explain later. The sound faded. Mason closed the scanner and slipped it back into the pack. He crossed to the hearth and lifted the green case, meaning to set it on the table. He froze halfway up. A slip of paper had been taped to the underside. It had been pressed flat to the metal, so his hand had covered it until the weight shifted. He peeled a corner loose and brought it to the lamp. Block letters. No signature. No punctuation. Leave it where it is. He stood quite still, the paper warming in his fingers. Arlo rose without a sound and stepped into the space between Mason and the door. The dog's head was level. His eyes were not on the room anymore. They were on the line where the door met the frame. Mason slid the note under the journal, reached down, and rested his palm gently on Arlo's neck. The fur there was warm from the lamp heat. The muscle under it was coiled and ready. In the glass of the window, the room reflected back at him for a moment like an old photograph. Man, dog, hearth with a missing tooth, snow falling. A place that wanted to be quiet and had been made to hold something heavier. He lowered himself onto the floorboards beside Arlo. He did not speak. The dog's breath came slow and even, a metronome that made the room honest. When the long hours of the first night finally pulled him toward sleep, he did not dream. He watched the seam of the door, the line of the window, and the dark mouth of the hearth, and he listened to the one presence in the cabin that had never lied to him. Sometime near midnight, a branch snapped outside, the kind of break that came from weight, not wind. Arlo did not bark. His growl rolled out quiet and steady until the air on Mason's skin felt charged. It faded after a long minute, not because the threat had left, but because it had chosen patience. Mason closed his eyes and understood what the locals meant when they called a place haunted. It was not the dead that troubled you. It was the living who believed the dead could keep a secret. By morning the storm had sanded the world white. The cabin sat quiet inside it, a square of breath showing at the broken window. Mason brewed coffee over the camp stove and set a bowl of water near the door for Arlo. The dog sniffed once, ignored both, and walked straight back to the hearth. He planted himself there like a sentry, chin level with the stones, eyes fixed on the same hand span of wall. No bark, no hurry. a steady, stubborn watch. Mason opened the green case again, this time with gloves so he would not contaminate anything. Each vial had a date and coordinate in block print. Some labels included a simple code, S for soil, W for water, and an arrowed number. He laid them out in 2 lines on the table until the arrangement began to make sense as a route. Creekbed 4A. Well 3. North Fork. He popped the cap on one vial long enough to catch the scent above the mouth. Nothing his nose could pass, but he knew better than to doubt the paper. He slid out a lab sheet and scanned it with the field unit. Benzene, arsenic, toluene. Levels exceeded EPA thresholds by 10 to 12 times. A second sheet from a different week carried the same contaminants at slightly different ratios, as if the poison had a schedule. He set a fresh page beside the results and sketched an outline of the valley from memory, then opened Renshaw's second notebook and copied the hand-drawn map onto his page. When he finished, the red circles from the journal formed a necklace around the low land, drifting toward the stream that curled behind Lot 12B. He added a dot where the cabin stood, and another where he remembered the trail bending. The circles gathered there, too. Behind him, Arlo moved. Not much, just the subtle shift of a soldier realigning on a doorway. He took 2 slow steps, nose high now, snuffing at the faintest trace of whatever spoke through stone. Then he set his right paw on the hearth edge and looked at Mason. It was the same look he had given in alley mouths overseas when wires lay where wires should not. He wanted the slab back in place. Mason understood the logic. The hole, once exposed, told the world the house had changed. He lifted the stone. The inner face still wore that gummy smear. He pressed it into the cavity, but did not seat it fully. He turned the lamp down and circled to the rear wall, where dawn made a thin silver rectangle on the boards. He lowered himself and looked along the baseboard until he found what he was hoping he would not. A hair-thin scuff in the dust where the trim met the floor. Recent, not the lazy arc of a mouse or the broad sweep of his own boot. He followed it to the corner where a knot sat dark in the pine. He pressed the knot with his thumb. It gave a fraction and clicked. He backed away, slow. He took a photo from 3 angles, then used the blade from his multi-tool to open the seam. A disc no larger than a button lay behind the knot, wired to a peel and stick pad. Not a camera. A contact mic with a small transmitter. He lifted it with the edge of the blade and held it to the light. Its power seat was empty. The battery he had found in the firebox would have fit perfectly. Arlo's stare on the hearth made new sense. Someone had sealed and unsealed that stone to hide or retrieve the battery without crossing the room and leaving tracks in open dust. They had stood where the dog now stood. They had pressed their knuckles against rock and listened to see if the house still had a heartbeat. Mason pocketed the mic and replaced the knot, then seated the hearth slab flush. If someone came back, it would look as they left it. He put on his parka and took a metal cup outside to the drift by the porch. He scooped clean snow, melted it on the stove, let it cool, and set it beside Arlo's untouched bowl. The dog nose-tested the melted snow and drank. He did not touch the tap water again. Mason closed the cabin valve under the sink and opened the spigot to bleed off pressure. Air hiccuped and spit, then died. He unscrewed the aerator and found a grey film clinging to the mesh. He bagged the screen, labeled it with a Sharpie, and set it beside the vials. He used the sat phone while the signal was awake. Not a call. A tight message with attachments to a secure drop Nora had given him when they were both younger and less tired. Journal pages, map photos, the contaminant tables. He typed a line beneath them that cost him a swallow. House may be live. Someone left a mic. Battery retrieved from hearth. He hit send. The bar crawled. Delivered. He stared at the word like it might vanish. A truck grew out of the storm near noon. County plate. Light bar dark. paint the color of road salt, the kind of vehicle that could park anywhere and be invisible. It pulled into the tree line across the bend and idled there with the engine just loud enough to be a presence. Mason did not move to the window. He let Arlo tell him. The dog walked to the door, sat with his body at an angle, and watched the seam without blinking. After a minute, the engine wound down and the truck rolled away. No knock, no neighborly drop-in. Just a reminder that the cabin was not alone. He returned to the notebooks. Renshaw had started clinically and ended cramped, the letters riding up against each other like the words could not fit. He wrote of unmarked trucks, of men who stood at the edge of a property as if the ground under their boots belonged elsewhere, of water that tasted like a coin held too long under the tongue. He noted that wildlife avoided the creek after sundown. He marked circle after circle around the wells. The company name repeated with the numbing insistence of a chant. Northbridge Minerals. Mason turned to a page where the hand steadied again. There, the map focused so tightly it was less a map and more a plan view. A box, a dot inside the box, a label in pencil pressed so hard it had scored the page beneath. Not a well number, a starting point. The cabin. He stepped outside into the muffled daylight and walked around the foundation until he found what he would have missed if he had not been looking for it. Behind a tangle of brush, squat iron cap sat 3 inches above the soil, painted to match nothing. He brushed snow off with his glove and read the stamp on the lid. Service discontinued. County water. His fingers traced the lip of the cap and came away with the same tack from the hearth mortar. Someone had opened this recently. He went still in that deep way the body remembers from other lives. Arlo appeared at his hip without being called. The dog's head cut from the iron cap to the tree line and back again. He breathed in, the way a dog reads a day. Then he pressed the side of his jaw lightly to Mason's leg and stood there until Mason's breath matched his. Back inside, Mason pulled a test strip kit from his field bag. The strips were not a lab, but they were more honest than his tongue. He took water from the opened spigot and from the snow, melt and dipped. The clean melt held its pale colors without argument. The tap sample bloomed into a pattern that made the back of his neck go hot. He photographed both, logged the time, labeled the bagged screens and the test strips, and set them in a hard case with foam that did not care what it guarded. Arlo rose from the hearth without looking away from it, and Pad walked to the door. His tail brushed the chair propped under the knob. He looked at Mason as if to say now. Mason put on his boots and grabbed his gloves. They took the narrow path behind the cabin where the drifts were knee-deep and the scrub oak wore hats. Arlo broke trail, nose a hand's width above the snow, working the wind. They moved with the economy of men who had walked in worse places. The creek was a dark ribbon under the ice, moving slow. Arlo halted at a cut bank, where the flow leaned hard on the bend, and dug at a spot where the snow was softer, as if heat rose there. Mason knelt, brushed aside powder, and found a circle of exposed ground the size of a dinner plate. He pressed his palm to it. Warm, not naturally. He brushed more, and uncovered a length of plastic hose the color of dead leaves running from the bank down into the water under the ice. It disappeared toward the tree line. He followed it with his eyes and found a patch of firs 20 yards off, where the snow had slipped in a clean rectangle, like a breath pulled through cloth. He did not walk to the firs. He rose and looked around without moving his head. He felt the old set of the world when you realize you are standing on someone else's plans. Arlo backed up a step without being told and took the leash in his mouth, a trick he had learned when Mason needed a reminder not to chase the wrong thing. They returned to the cabin by a different line, cutting windward so their tracks would drift shut. Inside, Mason took one of the vials labeled W4A and held it up to the weak light. A slick clung to the glass above the water like breath on a window. He set it down and opened the third notebook. The first page of that book was different. Not notes. A letter addressed to no one. If this is found, either I got careless or they did. They told me to stop. They smiled when they said it. The badge always smiles before it bites. I put a copy of the lab results where they won't think to look. Inside the wall, 3 feet left of the hearth, behind the board with the split knot. Mason looked at the wall. Then he looked at the knot he had already opened. He slid the blade in again, deeper to one side, and found a second recess where a finger could not reach without knowing where the notch lived. A rolled packet sat inside, waxed and tight. He teased it out and unrolled it on the table. Original lab letterhead, regional office stamp, signatures that were not the town's. The numbers were worse than the copies in the case. Arlo exhaled and settled his head on his paws without taking his eyes off the hearth. The room felt smaller, but the narrative had shifted. The hiding place inside the hiding place. The second cavity behind the first. Renshaw had not only recorded a crime, he had anticipated the men who would erase it. He had made 2 of everything a man could. Mason scanned the packet and sent it along the same path as the morning files. Then he wrote 10 words and attached them to the drop. Second cache found. Wall within wall. Still listening. He closed the sat phone and slid it under the blanket on the chair seat to muffle any buzz. The afternoon bent toward a blue kind of dark. Mason fed the stove enough to keep the cold honest and sat on the floor with his back against the table leg. Arlo lay close enough that their shoulders touched. The dog's ear brushed Mason's sleeve with each slow breath, a rhythm that quieted the part of the brain that liked to list threats. Outside, a snow machine passed on the far ridge, a long, even growl that came and went. Not locals. Wrong line for a pleasure run. A minute later, the sound returned softer, as if the rider had shut down and coasted. Mason reached without looking and rested his hand on the green case. He thought of the iron cap in the brush, and the warm circle by the creek, and the plastic hose that fed a current under ice. He thought of the badge that smiled. He thought of the battery on the hearth and the empty seat where it had belonged. He felt Arlo's head lift a fraction. The dog looked at the door, then at the hearth, then back to the door. It was not fear. It was the dog's way of drawing a line between 2 points, of making a map of the room and deciding where the next thing would come from. Mason did not speak. He did not reach for the rifle. He listened for the kind of silence that has weight. When it came, it was thin at first, and then whole, as if a figure had moved into the wind to let it pass without sound. The door seam held. The window glass ticked as the temperature dropped. The hearthstone sat in its seat, the secret folded behind it once more. Plot twists are sometimes loud. The better ones arrive like a dog lying down in a different place than he did yesterday. The well in the brush had been opened. The house had been wired. The creek carried a hose under the skin of ice. And Arlo, who would not drink from the tap, kept his gaze on the 1 square foot of stone where a hand would go if that hand meant to reach in and take back what the valley had already tried once to bury. By late morning, the valley thawed enough to let the road breathe. Mason heard the crunch of tires before the knock. He glanced through the curtain slit and saw the sheriff's cruiser parked at an angle by the porch. The hood still steamed from the climb. Sheriff Wade Gregson stepped out, uniform pressed, mirrored sunglasses slicing the white glare. His hand rested on his belt in a way that said, casual, but meant control. "Morning," he called, voice deep as the snow-melt creek. "Heard someone finally bought this old place. Thought I'd stop by, welcome you to the neighborhood." Mason opened the door halfway. "Appreciate it." Gregson's eyes flicked past him, sweeping the cabin. "Quiet up here. Folks say this land's got stories, strange ones." He smiled, just enough teeth to fit the role. You dig up any bones or find something that looks like trouble, just call me. Some things are better left where they were found." Arlo rose from his spot by the hearth, every inch of fur standing like a warning flare. His head was low, tail stiff. He didn't bark, he just watched. Gregson noticed. "Nice dog," he said. "Looks like he's seen more action than both of us combined." Mason forced a small smile. "He's retired. Doesn't like surprises." The sheriff adjusted his glasses, studying the scar near Mason's temple. "That right? You military?" "Used to be," Mason said. "Well," Gregson exhaled, tipping his hat. "Hope you find some peace up here. People move to Bitterroot looking for that. Just remember, this town doesn't like being dug into." He turned and walked to his cruiser, the snow giving under each step. Mason watched the tail lights fade down the hill, then looked at Arlo. The dog hadn't moved. Only when the sound of the engine was gone did he ease down, shoulders trembling with contained instinct. Mason knelt beside him. "You felt that too, huh?" Arlo's ears flicked once, like an answer. Inside, the cabin felt smaller. The sheriff's smell, cologne and old oil, still clung to the air. Mason replayed the conversation. The emphasis on trouble, the pause before bones. The man had known exactly what lay beneath those words. He went to the table, powered up the old field laptop, and began scanning the notebooks. Each page hummed under the small light. Coordinates, company names, cryptic notes. Renshaw had been methodical. Mason uploaded each image to the encrypted drive and converted the lab results into a secure archive. The screen reflected in Arlo's eyes as he paced, restless. The sat phone blinked. A message from Nora Diaz appeared, short and sharp as always. "Still alive out there? Heard Idaho auction was cursed? What did you find?" He smiled despite himself and typed, "Old house, bad water, maybe worse people. Sending files, need verification." He attached the data packet, encrypting it through the military-grade system they had used back in Kandahar. Nora wasn't just an old friend. She was the only person Mason trusted with a story that smelled like corruption. She replied within minutes. Copy received. Cross-checking Northbridge minerals. Stay low. Watch for local badges. They're tied in deep. Mason stared at the words until the screen dimmed. Outside, the forest groaned under the weight of melting snow. Then Arlo's head shot up. He moved to the window, hackles rising again. Mason followed his gaze. Through the trees, at the edge of the ridge, 2 headlights burned faintly, too still to belong to anyone passing through. They didn't flicker or move, just stayed there, watching. He killed the lamp and crouched low. The beam of light didn't waver. Whoever was out there wasn't hiding. They wanted to be seen. Arlo gave a quiet huff, the kind of sound he made before breaking cover in combat zones. Mason whispered, "Stay." He lifted the binoculars from his pack and angled them through the smallest crack in the curtain. The lights belonged to a dark truck, no plates visible, just like the ones Renshaw had drawn in his notebook. A figure sat inside, barely a shape, the glow of a cigarette pulsing red every few seconds. The figure turned its head, as if meeting the binoculars directly, and the truck lights shut off. Darkness folded back around the forest. Mason stayed still for a long time. The cabin creaked once, wind pushing under the eaves. He could hear Arlo's slow breathing behind him, steady but alert. The sat phone buzzed again, a delayed message from Nora. "Mason, Northbridge Minerals was fined 3 times for contamination. Local law blocked federal follow-up. Sheriff on the board. Repeat, Sheriff Wade Gregson." He read it twice. The words didn't shock him. They just locked everything into place. Mason looked at the hearth. The journals, the sealed vials, the microphone he'd found. All of it pointed in one direction. Gregson wasn't protecting secrets. He was built into them. Arlo whined softly, glancing from the door to Mason. His body leaned forward, ready for motion, waiting for a command. "Not yet," Mason whispered. "We play it quiet." He packed the case and the notebooks into a waterproof bag and sealed it tight. The storm outside had begun again, wind cutting through the pines. He opened the trap door beneath the floorboards and slid the bag into the crawl space between joists. When he replaced the boards, only Arlo's nose tracked the movement. Night closed over the cabin like a slow tide. Hours later, the low rumble of an engine drifted up the road again. Mason peered through the slit in the curtain. Another truck, different from Gregson's cruiser. It stopped just short of the porch. No one stepped out. Then the high beam flicked once, twice, like a signal. Arlo pressed against the door, teeth bared but silent. Mason lifted the rifle from its mount and kept it low. He watched until the truck finally rolled backward into the trees and vanished. He sat down beside Arlo on the floor. The dog leaned his head against Mason's shoulder, still tense. "Good boy," Mason murmured. "We're in it now." Arlo's tail thumped once on the boards, quiet and certain, like he already knew the war they'd just stepped back into. The snow outside had crusted into silence. Inside, the fire had burned down to coals that glowed like the eyes of something patient. Mason sat at the table, going through the day's notes again. Arlo lay near the door, one ear cocked, breathing even. The night felt still enough to believe the valley had finally decided to sleep. Then the sound came, too soft for anything human ears alone could catch. A scrape, metal touching metal. Arlo's head lifted first. No bark, no whine, just that low electric stillness before lightning. Mason didn't look up right away. He waited for confirmation. It came when the latch at the back of the cabin flexed, barely audible, but wrong in rhythm. Someone was picking the lock from the outside. He moved without sound. The pistol came from under the table, his fingers working the slide by memory. Arlo rose, the fur on his back standing. Mason whispered, "Easy." The lock clicked. The back door opened no wider than a breath. A gloved hand appeared through the crack, then a shoulder. Whoever it was moved like someone who had done this before. No hesitation, no noise, only confidence. Arlo launched. The world snapped into motion. His growl became a full-body thunder as he hit the intruder mid-step. A cry, cut short, filled the cabin. The man stumbled backward, weapon clattering. Arlo's jaws locked on the man's arm. A flash of muzzle fire tore through the dark. Wood splintered beside Mason's head. He dropped to a knee and returned fire, one round aimed low, controlled. The round clipped the doorframe near the man's leg. The intruder jerked, twisting free from Arlo, firing blindly. "Burn it down," he shouted, voice rasping through the mask. Then he was gone, swallowed by the storm. Smoke from the gunfire mingled with the cold air rushing through the open door. Mason stepped to the threshold, weapon steady, eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing. Only snow moving under the wind and the echo of retreating footsteps that disappeared too fast. He turned back. Arlo was standing, chest heaving, one paw braced. Blood dripped in a slow, steady rhythm onto the floorboards. It wasn't much, but enough to make Mason's stomach twist. He knelt, hand steady as he inspected the wound. The bullet had grazed Arlo's ribs, a shallow wound, bleeding hard but not deep enough to break bone. "Good boy, you held him off," Mason said, voice calm but tight. Arlo's tail moved once. His eyes stayed locked on the door, ready for another round. Mason holstered his pistol and grabbed the field med kit from his duffel. His motions were automatic, the old combat rhythm waking in his muscles. Gauze, pressure, tape. He pressed the dressing tight against the wound, holding firm until the bleeding slowed. Arlo flinched once but didn't resist. The wind outside rose, slamming the door half shut. Mason caught it and bolted it closed, then dragged the table across as reinforcement. He went to the window and lifted the binoculars again. No movement, no headlights. Whoever the man was, he had come with a clear task: set the fire, destroy the evidence. And Arlo had ruined it. He crouched beside his partner again. "You saved the whole damn place," he murmured. He slid the space blanket around Arlo's torso, tucking it in to keep the body heat close. The old dog trembled once, then settled, head resting against Mason's boot. Mason cleaned the blood from his hands and moved to inspect the damage. 2 bullet holes in the door, 1 round lodged in the timber beside the stove. He dug it out carefully with a knife. 9mm civilian grade, not law enforcement issue. He placed it in a zip bag. His breathing slowed as adrenaline ebbed. The quiet returned, but it was a different kind of quiet. Listening quiet. He stepped outside through the front door this time, rifle ready. The snow reflected the dim moonlight, showing a clean set of boot tracks leading away from the back porch. The prints were crisp, running parallel with the line of trees before vanishing into the dark. The man hadn't used a vehicle this time. He had walked, confident that the road would cover his retreat. Mason followed the tracks 20 yards, no further. His instincts screamed to push, to chase. But Arlo was hurt, and the cabin held everything they couldn't afford to lose. He stopped, crouched, and looked at the last visible print. Embedded beside it, half covered by snow, lay a spent lighter. Silver case, monogram scratched off, but edges clean. He picked it up and flipped the lid. Inside, faint residue of accelerant. He pocketed it and headed back inside. Arlo had shifted position but stayed alert, eyes on the window. Mason sat beside him, resting a hand on the dog's back. He could feel the steady pulse beneath the fur, the faint tremor of pain. He kept his voice low. "You held him long enough. That's what counts." He thought of Gregson's smile earlier that day. The way the sheriff's eyes had lingered on the walls, on the hearth. The warning, "If you find bones, leave them be." Now someone had come to burn those same bones to ash. He looked at the hearth. The stone was still sealed, but the meaning had changed. It wasn't just a hiding place. It was a target. He pulled the satellite phone and texted Nora again. "Intruder tonight. Armed, tried to burn cabin. Sheriff likely involved, needs secure extraction. Plan. Evidence intact for now." He hit send and waited for the confirmation ping. None came. The storm had taken the signal again. Mason leaned back, exhaustion catching up. He had learned to measure time, not in hours, but in heartbeats between danger. Tonight, that rhythm belonged to Arlo. The dog's breathing steadied. The bleeding had slowed to a dark stain on the bandage. Mason checked the wound again. Clean edges, no fragments. He heated a pack from his rations and fed Arlo small pieces by hand. The dog ate slow, still watching the windows. Outside, the snow whispered against the walls, hiding whatever waited beyond. When the lantern flickered, Mason caught himself staring into the dim reflection on the window pane. His own face, Arlo beside him, the outline of the hearth behind them. It looked like a photo from another life. Soldier and dog, guarding something the world had forgotten. He whispered, "We'll finish what Renshaw started." Arlo lifted his head, ears twitching, eyes locked on Mason's. No sound came, but the message was clear. He was ready for whatever came next. In the distance, through the snow, a faint orange glow flared for just a second. Maybe a cigarette, maybe a signal. Then it disappeared. The forest swallowed it whole. Mason reached for his rifle and turned the lamp down low. The cabin fell into shadow. Arlo shifted closer, his body touching Mason's leg, a living barrier between man and dark. The night held its breath again. Somewhere out there, the men who had come were waiting for another chance. But inside, Under the hum of the wind and the scent of gunpowder, Mason and Arlo waited too. And they weren't the ones afraid of the dark. The night had turned brittle, the kind of cold that makes glass hum. Mason hadn't slept, only dozed with his back against the door and the rifle across his knees. Arlo dozed beside him, breathing steady, patched flank rising and falling under the bandage. Around 3 a.m., the world felt still enough to believe the danger had passed. That was the lie the valley whispered right before it struck. The first warning came as a hiss, not wind, a liquid arc cutting the air. Mason turned just as the bottle shattered through the side window. Fire erupted in a bloom of orange and blue, the sound like a scream made of glass. The smell of gasoline punched through the cold. "Move!" he shouted. Arlo was already up, barking once, a short, sharp alarm that filled the cabin. Mason grabbed the satchel with the hard drives, notebooks, and vials, then swung his jacket over the fire that had caught on the rug. It smothered one patch, but the flames multiplied on the curtains, racing upward, eating oxygen. A second bottle came through the opposite window. The explosion hit low, spreading across the floor. Mason ducked behind the table. The heat bloomed in seconds. The logs in the hearth caught. The room turned into a furnace. He slung the satchel over his shoulder and crawled toward the front door, but the frame was already burning. The air there glowed. The handle pulsed red. Arlo darted ahead, tail low, scanning. The dog veered toward the back, where the earlier intruder had entered nights before. Mason followed, coughing, lungs clawing for air. He reached the rear latch and pushed, but the door jammed. Heat swelled behind him. Come on, he muttered, kicking the lower hinge. The wood gave a little, but not enough. Arlo turned back, teeth on Mason's sleeve, pulling hard. Mason tried again, but the air collapsed with a hollow sound, the roof groaning as the fire chewed through the beams. He didn't see the ceiling drop. Arlo did. The dog lunged, knocking Mason sideways as a section of burning timber fell where he'd been kneeling. The flames swallowed half the room. Arlo barked, low and commanding, then bit Mason's sleeve again, dragging toward the narrow pantry door Mason had half forgotten. All right. Mason coughed, voice shredded. He kicked the lower board. It cracked, opening into a narrow crawl hatch that led under the deck. The smoke curled down behind them as they crawled through. The last thing Mason saw of the cabin was the flash of blue light reflected in Arlo's eyes. They burst into the snow behind the house. The cold hit like a slap. Both collapsed, hacking smoke into the air that instantly turned to vapor. The fire had already consumed the walls, the roof folding inward with a roar. Mason pulled himself up, dragging Arlo by the harness. The dog limped but stayed on his feet. Together they stumbled to the edge of the tree line, the satchel clutched tight. The night lit up behind them, the flames turning the snowfield into a false sunrise. For a moment, Mason wanted to turn back. It wasn't about the structure, it was about everything inside it. Renshaw's notebooks, the data, the life of a man who had died for the truth. Then he felt the weight of the satchel and remembered. He hadn't lost it. It was right there. He dropped to his knees, chest heaving, and unzipped the flap. The drives were intact. The waterproof bag had done its job. He laughed once, a dry sound between relief and disbelief. Arlo pressed against him, shaking off melted snow and ash. The bandage had torn slightly, the wound seeping again. Mason tore open his field kit with trembling hands and worked fast. He cleaned the wound with saline, reapplied gauze, and wrapped it tight. Arlo stood stoically through the process, only flinching when Mason pulled the tape snug. "Good boy," Mason said softly. "You didn't let me burn in there." Arlo nudged his gloved hand, eyes steady, no fear left in them. Then the sat phone buzzed faintly inside the jacket pocket. The vibration felt almost out of place in the frozen quiet. Mason answered, voice raw. "Nora," he managed. Her voice came through low but clear. "I got the files, all of them. You're live on multiple mirrors. If someone's trying to bury this, they'll have to burn the internet." He exhaled, leaning his forehead against Arlo's. "Cabin's gone." "I figured. You okay?" "Alive. Dogs hit but stable. Whoever they are, they're not stopping." There was a pause. "Then neither do you," she said. "I'll get a federal contact in Boise to move on Northbridge. You need to stay invisible for 48 hours. You hear me, Hale? No hero moves." He smiled faintly. "I'll do my best." He ended the call and looked at the fire still devouring the cabin. Sparks drifted into the air like small ghosts. Somewhere inside, the last beams collapsed, throwing up a shower of embers that lit the falling snow. The wind carried the smell of burning pine and old secrets. Mason scanned the ridge. They couldn't stay in the open. Heat could be seen for miles. He pulled Arlo's harness tighter and pointed toward a cluster of rocks halfway up the slope, where a dark slit marked the entrance to a shallow cave he'd noticed earlier that week. They trudged through the snow, both of them half-shadows against the firelight. Arlo stopped once, looking back. Mason did too. The cabin was almost gone now, reduced to a single glowing skeleton. He wondered if Renshaw had died watching something similar, realizing too late that truth was flammable. When they reached the cave, Mason set down the satchel and cleared a patch of snow. He laid out the emergency blanket, checked Arlo's pulse, and then pulled his jacket over the dog's back to keep the warmth in. He lit a small survival heater and watched the vapor rise. The night had grown quiet again, but it wasn't peace. It was waiting. Somewhere down the valley, headlights flickered. Briefly, too far to identify, too deliberate to be random. Arlo's ears twitched. He gave a low rumble, not from pain this time, but warning. Mason whispered, "I know, they'll come back." He checked the pistol's magazine, then leaned back against the stone. In the faint light, he could see the reflection of Arlo's eyes, tired but defiant. The dog had pulled him out of fire, out of death itself. Now it was Mason's turn to protect him. He reached over and rested a hand on the thick fur of Arlo's neck. "You saved the story, partner. We're not done." Arlo's tail moved once, slow and certain, as the flames from the collapsing cabin died out in the distance. Mason looked into the darkness spreading across the valley and made his choice. No retreat, not while the truth still breathed. The morning came with the sound of rotors. Mason woke to the tremor before he heard it, the vibration of air turning heavy. The sun had barely broken over the ridge when the first helicopter swept in low, scattering loose ash from what had been the cabin. Arlo raised his head, ears twitching, eyes sharp but calm. He didn't bark. He never did when it mattered most. By the time Mason stepped out of the rock shelter, 2 more choppers had joined. They landed in staggered formation across the valley floor, their downwash whipping snow and soot into a blinding storm. Agents in black windbreakers moved fast. Department of Justice, EPA Criminal Investigation Division. Their insignias flashed like badges carved out of sunrise. Mason stood visible, rifle slung, hands raised halfway. Arlo padded beside him, gait uneven but steady. From one helicopter, a woman stepped out, pulling her hood tight against the wind. Her badge clipped to her vest read, "Ramirez, EPA Field Operations." She approached without hesitation, shouting over the rotor wash. "Mason Hale?" He nodded. "That's right. Where's the evidence?" Mason tapped the satchel at his side. "What's left of it? Files are already transmitted to DOJ servers. My contact verified receipt." Ramirez's expression softened just a fraction. "Good. You just made a lot of enemies regret waking up today." She waved behind her. "Secure the perimeter." Hazmat teams moved in, setting up tape and sample kits. One group began taking soil readings near the blackened foundation of the cabin. Another scouted the frozen creek bed. The smell of burnt pine mixed with something metallic and sour. Arlo froze mid-step, nose working the air. He turned toward the ridge and gave a low whine, a sound Mason hadn't heard since Fallujah, a warning, not of danger, but of discovery. "What is it, boy?" Mason murmured. Arlo moved forward, nose down, tracing a line through the snow toward a clearing behind the remains of the old well Renshaw had circled in his notes. The ground there looked wrong, too recently disturbed, snow packed differently, a small depression where the earth had sagged. "Over here," Mason called out. Ramirez and 2 investigators jogged over, one carrying a ground-penetrating radar unit. They swept the sensor in slow arcs. Within seconds, the monitor flickered with dense shapes beneath the frost. "Subsurface anomaly," one tech said quietly. 3 feet down." Ramirez crouched. "Dig." The team worked quickly, clearing the snow, cutting into the frozen soil with spades and gloved hands. Arlo stood behind Mason, watching. When the first glint of fabric appeared, he let out a single sharp bark, short, precise, like a command. Minutes later, they unearthed what none of them wanted to see: the outline of a human body wrapped in a tarp, the edges rotted through. A tangle of brown hair still clung to the skull. The tag from an old field jacket read, "E. Renshaw." For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind carried only the mechanical hum of the radar unit and the faint metallic clatter of tools. Ramirez rose, removing her gloves slowly. "We'll have the lab confirm, but this is him." Mason's jaw tightened. He stayed right where he warned he'd be. Behind them, the thrum of another engine grew louder. A convoy of black SUVs wound up the mountain road, headlights flashing against the ash. When they stopped, a handful of agents stepped out, and in the middle of them, cuffed, shoulders straight, was Sheriff Wade Gregson. He looked smaller without the badge, older without the smug ease. His face was unreadable. When he saw Mason, he gave that same faint smile, the one that didn't reach his eyes. "Told you this land had stories," he said. Ramirez's agents pulled him past. "Wade Gregson," she called out, voice carrying across the clearing. "You are under federal arrest for obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and conspiracy with Northbridge Minerals." "Anything you say?" Yeah. Gregson cut in, still smirking. "Save it for court. You people show up after the fire, after the mess, always too late." Mason stepped forward. "Not this time." Gregson's gaze slid to Arlo. "That the mutt that tore up my guy's arm?" Arlo didn't move, just stared back, unblinking, steady, the same posture he had used when guarding convoys overseas. Gregson's grin faltered. He turned away, but the swagger had drained. Ramirez leaned toward Mason. "The samples you recovered match what Renshaw documented. Benzene and arsenic levels 12 times EPA limits. The valley water's poisoned?" Mason nodded, eyes on the well. "He died trying to warn people." "And you picked up where he left off," Ramirez said quietly. A medic approached to check Arlo's wound, but Mason waved him off. "He's fine." Ramirez studied them both, then motioned to the forensic unit. "Bag the remains carefully. We'll transfer them to Boise for positive ID." She turned back to Mason. "The DOJ wants a statement. The press will be here within hours." Mason exhaled, looking at the fire-blackened ruins of the cabin. "I'll talk when the valley's clean, not before." Arlo brushed against his leg, pressing just enough weight to steady him. As the agents moved around them, setting markers, photographing, digging deeper, Mason stood still, listening. The helicopters droned overhead, their shadows sliding across the snow like long, silent witnesses. He glanced at Arlo, who sat down beside him, posture perfect, tail still. The dog's gaze followed the federal team as they lifted the remains from the ground. It was the same look he'd worn on missions, watching a fallen comrade come home. Ramirez's radio crackled. EPA confirms the second site. Multiple dumping points. Northbridge HQ already under warrant. She smiled grimly. You broke the chain, Hale. This whole valley's going to change. Mason didn't answer. His eyes drifted toward the tree line where the cabin once stood, where the first growl had started all of this. For a second, the smoke rising from the ruins looked almost alive, like something finally leaving. He placed a hand on Arlo's neck. We did what we came to do. The dog leaned into the touch, eyes still locked on the men loading the evidence. He didn't wag his tail, didn't move. He just watched, sentinel still, as the truth he had found was finally being carried out into daylight. Above them, the sun broke through the haze, turning the ash in the air to gold. It caught on Arlo's fur, making the old scars on his muzzle glint. For the first time in years, Mason felt warmth that wasn't from fire, and beside him, silent and proud, Arlo stood guard, just like he always had, over a truth that no one could bury again. By noon, the air above Pine Hollow was alive with the sound of news choppers. The once quiet valley had become a spectacle of tripods, microphones, and satellite vans parked along Main Street. The old town hall, where Mason had once renewed his driver's license in silence, was now surrounded by national reporters and flashing cameras. The banner behind the podium read, Department of Justice Press Briefing, Pine Hollow Environmental Crimes. Inside, the air was thick with the hum of voices and the faint echo of coffee cups clinking. Mason sat in the front row, Arlo at his feet, resting but alert. His bandage was clean, the wound already closing. The dog's coat caught the afternoon light through the tall windows, silver flecks shimmering in his fur. To the crowd, he didn't look like a dog recovering from fire and bullets. He looked like he belonged there, like the calm center of a storm. At the podium, Agent Ramirez finished her statement. Today, Northbridge Minerals and associated parties have been formally charged with environmental negligence, bribery of local officials, and obstruction of federal investigation. Over 20 executives and local enforcers are in custody. The poisoning of Pine Hollow's water supply has been confirmed as deliberate concealment. Flashes went off. Reporters raised hands, questions tumbling over each other. Agent Ramirez, who initiated the evidence leak. Was the local sheriff part of the conspiracy? What about Mason Hale? Was he working under federal orders? Ramirez looked toward Mason, her eyes softening slightly. Mr. Hale can speak for himself. A hush rippled through the room as Mason rose. The years of service had left him with the posture of someone who never asked for attention, and that only made people listen harder. He stepped up to the microphone, adjusted it once, and looked out at the crowd. I'm not a federal agent, he began, voice hoarse from smoke and too many sleepless nights. I'm not a whistleblower or a hero. I'm a man who followed his dog. A few quiet laughs rippled through the room, unsure whether to believe him. He didn't smile. He led me through a storm, through fire, and straight into the truth, Mason said. His gaze drifted down to Arlo, sitting tall beside the podium, eyes fixed ahead. He's never lied to me. Animals don't. People do. Cameras clicked in rapid fire. The stillness that followed felt heavier than the noise. I don't have speeches or slogans, Mason continued. But if you want to know what justice looks like, it's sitting right here. He didn't bark for food or praise. He barked because something was wrong, and he didn't stop until somebody listened. Ramirez stepped forward, almost whispering, That's enough, Hale. But Mason wasn't done. Northbridge tried to burn it all. Sheriff Gregson helped them cover it up, but truth doesn't die easy. Sometimes it just takes a soldier and a dog to dig it out." Applause broke. Not wild or performative, but deep, like something real had cracked open. Arlo blinked slowly, steady under the flashes. One reporter knelt in front of him, microphone lowered. "Good boy, huh? You're the reason this whole thing broke open." Arlo didn't move, only flicked his ear at the sound. To Mason, that quiet was louder than any speech. Later, outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed again. That's when the twist no one expected unfolded. Ellie Hart, the deputy who had been missing from duty since the fire, walked up the courthouse steps. Her uniform was crisp, but her expression was stripped of the usual small-town politeness. She handed a manila envelope to Ramirez. "Forensics logs, internal memos, and Gregson's private communications," Ellie said clearly, her voice carrying just enough to reach the cameras. "He wasn't working alone. The corruption goes higher." Ramirez opened the folder, scanning the pages, then looked up, stunned. "Where did you get these?" "Let's just say," Ellie replied. The sheriff's password was dumber than his morals. A reporter shouted, "Why come forward now, deputy?" Ellie hesitated, eyes flicking toward Mason and Arlo at the bottom of the steps. "Because my sister died 3 years ago," she said quietly. "Liver cancer. We blamed bad genetics. Turns out it was the same water Northbridge promised us was safe for families." Gasps rippled through the crowd. For a moment, even the cameras stopped clicking. Ellie looked directly into one of the lenses. "Sometimes the badge smiles for the wrong side," she said. "But when it finally bites, it bites hard." Mason met her eyes. For the first time since the fire, he allowed himself a small nod of respect. She nodded back. By sunset, the DOJ press trucks rolled away, the crowd thinning until only locals remained. Mason sat on the courthouse steps, the warmth of the day already fading. Arlo lay beside him, head resting on Mason's boot. Ramirez walked past, stopping just long enough to murmur, "You should get some rest. You've done your part." Mason looked out over the square, at the people gathering by the fountain, holding each other, whispering. "It's not done," he said. "Not until the water runs clean again." Ramirez smiled faintly. "Then I guess neither of you are off duty yet." When she left, Mason leaned down, scratching behind Arlo's ear. The dog closed his eyes, leaning into the touch. "You hear that? Partner? They think we're heroes." Arlo lifted his head, exhaled softly, and stared into the distance where the ridgeline burned gold in the setting sun. Mason followed his gaze. The valley felt lighter, almost breathing again. Somewhere a child laughed, clear, untainted, like the first sound of healing. Mason whispered, half to himself, half to the dog who had dragged him through hell and fire. "Guess you gave them back more than the truth." Arlo blinked once, tail brushing the step. The war was over, but his watch wasn't. And as the last light faded from the courthouse square, the dog who never lied sat there quietly, guarding a town that finally believed. The valley thawed slowly that spring. By late March, the snow had receded to the far shadows of the timberline, leaving behind a landscape of mud, charred roots, and the faint smell of wet ash. It was the kind of silence that came only after something terrible had burned itself out. A silence that wasn't peace yet, just exhaustion. Mason Hale stayed. He could have left. The government offered relocation, even a commendation ceremony he didn't attend. But he stayed because walking away felt like another kind of betrayal. The land had carried too many lies. Someone had to rebuild it honestly. The first beam he raised was cedar. He carved it himself, using the same tools his father once kept in a trunk back in Boise. Each swing of the hammer was steady, deliberate. No music, no chatter, just the rhythmic thud of labor. Arlo lay nearby on a blanket, his fur streaked with patches of grey that hadn't been there before the fire. The scar along his left flank glowed faintly in the afternoon sun. He watched Mason work with the patient focus of a sentry, eyes half closed, but never drifting far from the tree line. Neighbors came by in 2s and 3s at first. Some brought sandwiches or coffee, others just curiosity. No one asked too many questions. Pine Hollow had learned that some answers were buried too deep or cost too much. Old man Greeley, who ran the mill, offered scrap lumber. "No charge," he said. "You and that dog gave this town a second chance." Mason shook his head. "We didn't give anything, just took out the rot." "Same thing if you ask me," Greeley replied, spitting into the dirt. "Rot's what kills slow." By midsummer, the frame of the new cabin stood proud against the slope, smaller than before, but truer somehow. The roof was tin, hand-bent and fixed with copper nails. He'd learned that simplicity survived best. On the porch, a wooden plaque read, "Renshaw's Rest, for those who spoke the truth. Every nail, every plank held memory." Mason built it not as a home, but as a testimony. A promise that stories wouldn't die the next time greed tried to bury them. The townspeople helped clear the old trail behind the cabin. It wound up the ridge where Arlo had first barked that night, the sound that had changed everything. When they placed a marker at the start, one of the local kids suggested a name. "Canine Ridge," he said shyly, "for the dog that found the truth." The name stuck. They carved it into the post, and the mare nodded like it had always been meant to be. In the evenings, Mason would sit on the porch steps with Arlo beside him, watching the sunset melt into the horizon. The fire scars on the land softened under the new green shoots pushing through. Nature, he realized, didn't hide its wounds. It grew around them. The media eventually moved on. The scandal that had once filled every headline gave way to the next storm somewhere else. Pine Hollow faded from the national spotlight, left to heal in quiet. But within the valley, people remembered. They remembered the smell of burning pine, the sight of a man and his dog standing against the odds, the sound of a bark that had called justice back to life. One afternoon, Nora Diaz arrived unannounced. She'd traded her city blazer for jeans and a windbreaker, but the sharpness in her eyes was the same. "Still can't stay out of trouble, huh?" she said, smiling faintly. "Cabin standing this time," Mason replied. "Guess that's progress." She crouched, rubbing Arlo's neck. The old shepherd wagged his tail once, slow but firm. "I heard they're naming a scholarship after Renshaw," she said, "for young journalists who chase stories nobody wants to touch." Mason looked towards the wooden plaque. "He'd like that. He'd like that you didn't quit," she said softly. He didn't answer. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was the kind that carried gratitude without needing words. When she left, she didn't say goodbye, just raised a hand towards the ridge. Mason watched her disappear down the road until the dust swallowed her. As the sun dipped low, the cabin's cedar walls glowed orange. Arlo rose stiffly, stretched, and walked to the edge of the porch. His gait was slower now, but his posture hadn't changed. He stood tall, head lifted, scanning the valley as if guarding something invisible yet sacred. Mason stepped beside him, hands on his hips. "You still see ghosts out there, partner?" Arlo didn't turn. He just stared into the wind, tail flicking once. Mason followed his gaze and saw nothing, only the quiet roll of the forest, the hum of cicadas, and a hawk circling high above the ridge. "Yeah," Mason murmured. "Me too." He crouched and ran a hand through Arlo's fur, feeling the heat of life beneath the coarse hair. "Guess this is home now." Arlo leaned into him, pressing his weight against Mason's leg, and for a brief second the war veteran felt something he hadn't in years, peace that didn't feel borrowed. When night fell, the cabin lights glowed warm against the dark, a single pulse of defiance in a valley once drowned by silence. From the porch, Arlo lay down, chin on his paws, eyes half open towards the ridge. Mason sipped coffee, the bitter kind he always made too strong, and watched the moon rise over Canine Ridge. Somewhere out there, under the same sky, the memory of fire and fear still lingered. But here, in the small cabin rebuilt from ashes, a man and his dog sat in quiet companionship. Proof that sometimes survival wasn't about winning. It was about staying. And in that stillness, Mason finally understood. The valley hadn't haunted him. It had been waiting for someone to listen. Beside him, Arlo gave a soft, contented sigh, the sound of a soldier at rest. The night answered with silence, clean, unbroken, and earned. It had been almost a year since the fire. The hills around Pine Hollow were green again, thick with wild flowers that had pushed through last summer's ash. The valley looked alive now, but the people who lived there carried a different kind of awareness, a quiet vigilance that came from knowing how easily truth could be buried, and how hard it was to dig back up. On a mild April morning, a yellow school bus wound its way up the dirt road toward Canine Ridge. The laughter of children echoed through the pines. Mason watched from the porch, leaning against a post, coffee steaming in his hand. Arlo lay at his feet, muzzle grayed, one ear perked. The teacher, Mrs. Leary, waved as she led her class up the trail. "Mr. Hale, thank you for letting us visit again," she called. "You're always welcome," Mason said. "Just don't let them feed him jerky. He'll follow you home." A few of the kids giggled as Arlo thumped his tail lazily. The group gathered in front of the small cedar cabin and the plaque beside it. The wooden sign, carved by Mason himself, read, "Some truths bark before they speak." Mrs. Leary gestured to it. "Who can tell me what that means?" The kids exchanged looks. One boy, tall for his age with freckles and an earnest squint, raised his hand. "It means sometimes animals know things before we do?" Mason smiled. "You're not wrong, Lucas." The boy's name was Lucas Myers, a 7th grader from the local middle school. He'd been working on a history project titled "Truth That Doesn't Fit in Textbooks." When he'd written to Mason asking if he could interview him for it, Mason almost said no. But something in the letter, its honesty, its curiosity, had reminded him of Renshaw. After the class tour, Lucas stayed behind while the others hiked to the ridge overlook. He carried a small recorder and a notebook, pages filled with questions written in careful pencil. "Can I ask a few more?" Lucas said. "Sure," Mason replied, settling onto the porch step. Arlo stretched, moved closer, and rested his head on Lucas's shoe. The boy froze, wide-eyed. "It's okay," Mason said softly. "That means he trusts you." Lucas smiled, whispering, "Hi, Arlo." The recorder clicked. "Mr. Hale, do you think people always tell the truth when it matters most?" Mason took a moment before answering. "No, sometimes they're too scared, sometimes they don't know how. But truth has a way of waiting. Someone always finds it eventually." "Like you did." Mason shook his head. "Like he did." He nodded toward Arlo. "I just followed." Lucas scribbled furiously. "So, would you say truth is alive?" Mason chuckled quietly. "Maybe not alive, but it breathes. Every time someone listens, it breathes again." From the ridge, the teacher called down, "Lucas, time to go." "Coming." He shouted back, but didn't move. "Can I ask one last thing?" "Go ahead." Lucas hesitated. "Do you ever wish it hadn't happened? The fire, the company, all of it?" Mason looked out over the valley, the sunlight washing the pines, the rebuilt roofs glinting in the distance. He exhaled slowly. "No, I wish it hadn't needed to happen. but I don't regret what it showed us." Lucas nodded, closing his notebook. "My dad says bad things teach us what we don't want to be." "That's a smart man," Mason said. When the boy stood, Arlo nudged him once, just enough to make Lucas laugh. "He's saying goodbye," Mason told him. "Or maybe thank you," Lucas said, scratching behind the shepherd's ear. As the bus rumbled away, Mason stayed on the porch, the sound fading into the distance. Arlo had already dozed off again, head between his paws. That afternoon, Nora drove up in a rental truck bearing a new sign for the town square. The letters gleamed silver, Renshaw Water Watch Foundation. She had made it official, an independent non-profit that tested well water across the state, staffed by young volunteers and supported by donations. "Funded mostly by people who used to work for Northbridge," she said wryly. "Funny how guilt opens wallets." Mason helped her unload the sign. "Still, it's something." She nodded. "It's more than something. Every town that joins means fewer families drinking poison." He paused, then asked, "Why keep Renshaw's name?" "Because people like him don't fit in headlines," she said. "They fade unless someone keeps saying their names." Arlo ambled over, sniffed the sign, and sat beside it as if blessing it. Nora smiled. "I swear he knows." "He always does," Mason replied. Later, the townsfolk gathered near the square to watch the sign go up. Kids ran circles around Arlo, tying blue ribbons to his collar like medals. He tolerated it with quiet dignity, tail flicking once every so often. Mrs. Leary's class presented a framed essay from Lucas's project. Across the top, in bold letters, it read, "The Dog That Found the Truth." Below it, Lucas had written, "Some heroes use words, some just refuse to walk away. The difference between the two is what saves a town." Mason read it twice, his throat tightening. He placed a hand gently on Arlo's back, feeling the slow, steady rise and fall beneath his palm. That evening, when the crowd dispersed, Mason and Nora lingered by the sign. The lights from the valley shimmered below, reflected in Arlo's eyes. "Do you think he knows what he started?" Nora asked quietly. Mason smiled. "He doesn't need to. He just did what was right." Arlo shifted his weight, pressing against Mason's leg, and let out a soft, low sound, half sigh, half hum. It was the same sound he used to make before a mission, when everything was still uncertain, but purpose was clear. The wind rolled through the pines, carrying the faint smell of cedar and clean water. Mason tilted his head, listening to the sound. For the first time, the valley didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt awake. He looked up at the ridge, the path now marked by small wooden posts the children had painted. The last one, near the tree line, bore Arlo's paw print in wet cement. Mason said quietly, "Guess some truths bark louder than others." Nora smiled. "And some keep barking long after the world stops listening." They walked back toward the cabin under a sky full of stars, Arlo trotting between them, still alert, still guarding, even as the world around him began, finally to heal. The sun was sinking behind the Bitterroot Mountains, spilling gold across the valley like a slow-burning ember. The rebuilt cabin stood quiet against the wind, its cedar walls catching the last of the light. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney. The world around Pine Hollow had settled into peace, the kind that feels both earned and fragile. Mason sat on the porch, boots crossed, a mug of black coffee in his hand gone cold hours ago. Beside him, Arlo lay stretched across the boards, his coat catching the light in shades of grey and bronze. The old shepherd's breathing was steady, slow, but every so often, one ear flicked towards the forest, still listening. Always listening. Down the dirt path, laughter broke the quiet. A young family was hiking the Canine Ridge Trail, their son running ahead, his small backpack bouncing with each step. When he reached the cabin, the boy froze, staring up at the bronze plaque fixed beside the porch rail. He read the words aloud, his voice small but clear. He didn't bark for food, he barked for the truth. His parents caught up, smiling apologetically at Mason. "Sorry, sir, he's got a thing for dogs. Every time he sees one, he stops." Mason smiled back. "That's a good habit." The boy crouched near Arlo, who lifted his head, curious but calm. "Is this the dog from the story?" The boy asked softly. For a long moment, Mason didn't answer. He watched Arlo blink, the dog's gaze deep and amber like old whiskey. Then he nodded. "Yeah," Mason said quietly. "That's him." The boy smiled wide. "Does he still guard the cabin?" Mason looked out toward the trees swaying under the wind, shadows flickering like ghosts of the past. He took a breath that tasted of pine and wood smoke. "He's not guarding the cabin," he said finally. "He's guarding what matters." The boy seemed to think about that. "What's that?" Mason looked down at Arlo. The shepherd met his eyes, steady, unwavering, the same look that had pulled him through fire, corruption, and silence. "The truth," Mason said. The wind picked up, rustling through the tall grass. The family waved and continued up the trail. Mason stayed seated, watching their silhouettes fade into the orange dusk. He reached down and rubbed Arlo's neck gently. "Guess you're still doing your job, huh?" Arlo shifted, laying his head against Mason's boot. A low, contented rumble vibrated in his chest, the sound of a sentinel at peace. As the light dimmed, the valley turned blue and gold, the line between earth and sky blurring. Across the ridge, fireflies began to flicker, tiny sparks of life where once there had been only smoke and fear. Mason sat quietly, the weight of memory soft but constant. He thought of Renshaw, of Nora's foundation, of the children who came to learn not from books, but from scars carved into the land. He looked at the plaque again. The edges had already started to weather, the bronze darkened by rain and time. Still, the words remained clear. He ran his thumb across them, almost whispering to himself. He didn't bark for food. He barked for the truth. The truth had cost him everything once, sleep, blood, silence. But it had given him something back, too. Purpose. And sitting there, with the old dog beside him, Mason knew he wouldn't trade that for anything. The night deepened. Somewhere down the valley, an owl called. The forest answered with the hush of wind through pine needles. Arlo's breathing slowed, his head heavy against Mason's leg. The soldier leaned back in his chair, the creak of wood echoing softly. "Rest easy, buddy," Mason murmured. "You've earned it." But even as his eyes closed, Arlo's didn't. They stayed half open, watching the ridge, the porch, the world he'd sworn, wordlessly to protect. From a distance, a car approached, headlights sweeping briefly across the cabin before disappearing into the road's curve. For a heartbeat, Mason thought of how many lives had crossed paths here, some lost, some saved, all changed. The fireflies glowed brighter now, like little beacons in the dark. One landed on the plaque, right beneath the line about truth, its light pulsing in rhythm with the dog's slow breath. And in that soft, golden flicker, it felt like something, someone, was still watching. A gentle breeze stirred the wind chime Nora had hung above the door. The faint metallic notes drifted into the night, mingling with the whisper of pine and the steady heartbeat of the valley. Mason looked toward the horizon one last time before heading inside. Arlo stayed where he was, stretched out beneath the plaque, eyes half shut but still awake to every sound. The porch light flickered, and the night folded over the cabin like a warm blanket. the world moved on. But the ridge, the truth, and the shepherd never did. And as the screen fades to black, a line appears, simple, quiet, and true. He didn't bark for food. He barked for the truth. Then, as the music swells, the final words appear. What's your story with a loyal pet? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to German Shepherd Stories, where loyalty still has a voice, and every bark carries a truth worth hearing.